Hey everyone, welcome to Intro to Labor Studies, week whatever we're on of quarantine now. I hope that you're all staying healthy and that you're staying home if you're able to, and that your families are healthy. Okay. So a few housekeeping announcements. I've posted assignment 3 on Blackboard. So this is the last of the 3 short writing assignments. It'll have basically the same parameters as the previous ones. It's going to have the same grading rubric. It'll be worth the same amount. So if you recall, just another reminder that you can choose 2 of the 3 short writing assignments. This is the final one. Or if you've completed 1 and 2, you can choose to skip this one, or you can choose to also do the 3rd one, and I'll drop the lowest grade. So it'll be due Friday, April 17th by the end of the day. And I've actually made part of your assignment for this week to do the beginning of the paper. So for those of you who aren't going to complete the assignment, who choose not to, don't worry about it. You still have to do the Blackboard post this week, but you don't have to do the more in-depth version that your paper will be. And for those of you who do choose to do assignment 3, you will have a piece of it already begun. You'll at least start thinking about it this week. As always, I do have office hours online. So that is via Blackboard Collaborate, Wednesday and Friday, 2 to 4 p.m. If you're uncomfortable with using that platform for any reason, I can always schedule something individual with you. We can have a phone call, we can have a Zoom conference, whatever is easiest for you. Let's see. Okay, so for this week, you read the first half or so of this book, Fashionopolis, by Dana Thomas, who is a journalist. And I think it's a pretty accessible book, as I mentioned in my email. It's pretty interesting and readable. Hopefully you're enjoying it at least a little bit more than some of you enjoyed The Greenhouse, which is to say you didn't enjoy The Greenhouse at all. So hopefully this one reads a little bit better for you. And I chose this one. I wanted us to do an in-depth dig or a case study into a particular industry. I thought about doing, transportation, particularly since I'm from Detroit, but you all are probably tired of hearing me talk about Detroit at this point. I thought about electronics, how iPhones and laptops are made. I ended up going with fashion for a few reasons. One is because presumably we're all participants in this economy. 2, because we're in Lowell, obviously we've mentioned the history of Lowell. I'm not going to go into a ton more detail because we have talked about it already, but we are located in a city that's built on textiles and on the fashion industry. So it is really part of the foundation of our university, the Lowell Textile Institute. It gives us a reason to talk about trade agreements and global supply chains. It lets us think about workers' rights, and then it lets us integrate environmental concerns into that. This week, we're not going to talk as much about the environmental concerns, but we're going to go more in depth on those next week. So just so you're prepared for that. But I wanted to find an industry that everybody has some kind of stake in. Everybody wears clothes, presumably. Everybody buys clothes, right? Okay, so a few facts and figures from Dana Thomas just to set the scene that I wanted to highlight. 1, we buy 5 times more clothing now than we did in 1980, which adds up to 68 pieces of clothing per year in 2018. That's a lot. I was trying to figure out if I'm higher or lower than that average. I think I'm probably lower, but it's hard to say because like most of you, I've never really sat down and tracked that. And I have put page numbers here from the introduction, so if you want to go back to find these quotes later. 2, between 1990 and 2012, the US garment industry lost 1.2 million jobs. So if you put that in conversation with the first fact that we're buying way more clothing, but it's not being made in the US. 3, the fashion industry employs 1 out of 6 people across the globe, and fewer than 2% of those people in the fashion industry are actually earning a living wage. And then finally, Americans throw away 80 pounds of clothing per person per year. And we'll talk more about that impact next week in next week's reading. Okay, so that sort of sets the scene for us about some of the parameters. And I think the thing to take away from the first chapter is that this really is a shift from how Americans have bought and consumed clothing than any time in our history. And Dana Thomas says that the 80s are really when this shift to what she calls fast fashion starts to happen. So let's just go through a few terms first, and then we'll kind of be on a level playing field in terms of what we're talking about here. So we talked about offshoring 2 weeks ago. This is when you take a manufacturing plant, move it to another country across national borders, and almost always what we've seen is that this is because other countries have lower labor costs, you don't have to pay as many taxes, and there are lower environmental standards elsewhere. And so when we go back and think about 1.2 million textile jobs lost in the United States, this is the primary driver of that offshoring. The opposite of offshoring is onshoring. Again, I think we talked about this 2 weeks ago, but sometimes called inshoring or reshoring, and it's bringing manufacturing back. So manufacturing that had been moved out of the country is brought back for a variety of reasons that Dana Thomas talks about. Some of that is because it does end up being cheaper when you factor in shipping and other kinds of logistical expenses. It also has a popular appeal, so kind of this idea of bringing American jobs home, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Buy American campaign in next week's lecture. Another term that Dana Thomas uses is right shoring, which is also called best shoring. And this is a broader term. Actually, Hillary Clinton in part made this popular, oddly enough, in the 90s. And it refers to choosing a manufacturing location, whether it's in the same country or out of the country, but based on usually an external consultant saying, here's all the costs, direct costs, the indirect costs, here's what you're losing in shipping costs, here's also what you're losing in the lag time that it takes to, let's say, so in one of the early chapters, Dana Thomas talks about this designer, and she says people will be taking down notes and taking pictures, and then fast fashion companies like H&M or Zara will be able to churn those designs out within a matter of weeks, and you'll see them on the shelves in the stores. And she mentions one of the companies will actually have people on the ships who are sewing the clothing. So the materials are sourced in another country, but in order to save time, to turn around the time of from when that design is presented to the moment when the consumer can buy a cheaper version of it, they actually are having that done during shipping. So the indirect costs would be the loss of revenue if, you know, if you're H&M and Zara or Primark has a version of that dress 3 weeks sooner than you, that's an indirect cost because you're losing out because someone else has beaten you to it. Okay. When we talk about fast fashion, again, this is all about clothing that's produced quickly, that's produced cheaply, and that tracks those fashion trends really, really tightly. So this turnaround of a few weeks. And this is all about the trends on the previous slide that we looked at. So you're buying more clothing, it's often made of cheaper materials, it's thrown away faster, it's not meant to be reused in the way that in previous generations our family members if they were middle class particularly and above, and even a lot of working class wear, would buy clothing and then reuse it, recycle it in different ways. And now our model is the opposite of that. There's Hilda saying her weekly hello to all of you. So slow fashion is just the opposite of that. It's the term applied to a movement where you are looking at things like recycling options, you're looking at environmental impacts, and the general push of slow fashion is to buy fewer pieces that are made of higher quality, so they'll last you a longer time. So you are still buying clothing, however, the overall impact is lower on the environment and on your budget, etc. And then the last piece is called vertical integration. So if there's one thing that you're taking away from this class, it's subcontracting, right? And all of the problems that that implies. So often when we talk about subcontracting, that is a key word that tells you that something is happening that is a good business practice. It's cheaper, but it's maybe not the best for workers, is usually what subcontracting implies, right? So in a typical fashion company, and we'll look at an example of this, you have a brand, and maybe that brand is the Gap. That brand subcontracts out or contracts out to different plants, and a lot of those companies will actually subcontract out further. So there's this really long supply chain. And often what happens, if you've completed the reading, you'll know. If you haven't finished it yet, you'll find out, is that let's say that something happens, a fire in a factory or a disaster, and the parent company, the brand, will say, we didn't know that this was happening. We didn't know about it because they were a subcontractor. How could that be? Well, basically what happens is a contractor will go so far down that chain of subcontracting that the parent company is really only keeping track of its main contractors, and they're not paying attention to who's getting subcontracted to fill those orders for the contractors. So it may be true that they actually don't know what's happening further down that supply chain. When we talk about vertical integration, that means that all of those chains of subcontracting are collapsed. So basically, one company is doing all of the pieces of manufacturing itself and is not contracting or subcontracting out to anyone. So an example would be an auto parts factory, or let's say, I have a Chevy Sonic. Now my Chevy is assembled in the United States. It's actually assembled in a plant that is about 15 miles from my hometown, which is one of the reasons why I bought it. However, even though it's assembled in the United States, my Chevy has parts from all over the place. And in fact, a lot of the parts of my Chevy are made in Mexico. So in some ways, it's really meaningless to say this car is made in America. It's assembled in America, but a lot of the parts come from foreign labor, and they come from all over the place. So there's one contractor and maybe subcontractor that does the textiles for the seats. There's one that is making the mufflers. There's one that's making carburetors. And then all of those parts are assembled in the same place. Whereas if we were talking about a vertically integrated company, and they were located in the United States, then you could say that that Made in America label really does mean it's made in America, because the company is making every single one of those parts itself. From, so in the example of fashion, from growing the cotton in their own company all the way to sewing and assembling the clothing. Okay, so that's vertical integration. Okay, so let's talk about NAFTA in a little bit more depth than we've done. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It was ratified in '93 and went into effect in 1994. And the main point of NAFTA was to open up trade between Canada, Mexico, and the US. So in order to do that, it has a lot to do with the kinds of tariffs and taxes that are imposed on any kind of trading that happened between any of those countries. And the goal was, by increasing trade, this is going to be an economic benefit to all three of those countries because we're trading more, which means we're buying more, which means we're increasing jobs in all of those countries. And this plays into the immigration issues that we've been talking about for the past 2 weeks. So the theory is that if we open up trade with Mexico, there will be more Mexican jobs that are decent, and it'll stem some of that tide of Mexican immigration across the border. So that's the theory. It also established these tax-free zones, the maquiladora zones, in Mexico, where companies could basically have parts made and import them, and they didn't have to pay taxes on that piece of the product. So if you're paying taxes to import a part, that's going to drive up the eventual cost. Whereas, now my Chevy Sonic can have all of these different pieces of it made in Mexico. They can all be imported into the United States without tariffs. That increases the ability of the company to sell cheaper cars, which again, the theory is, for me as a consumer, that's better for me because I'm not paying as much. And it's better for the company because they're not paying as much in taxes. This is certainly part of what we have put under this broad umbrella of neoliberalism. And certainly, if you think back to the beginning weeks of our course, it's really part of this shift towards corporations having a lower tax burden. And if you think about paying taxes, what does that money go to? Well, it's not a coincidence that NAFTA is happening in the same years as policies like rollbacks of the welfare system, welfare reform during the Clinton era, the war on drugs. So things that are kind of reducing the social safety net, because we don't have as much tax money to use on things like that when we're providing incentives. And again, the theory is that with companies doing so well, those benefits will trickle down to employees and to everyday people. One important thing about NAFTA is it didn't have any provisions to make sure that any kind of environmental or labor standards were upheld throughout the trade network. So it was basically just like, Canada has its own standards, the US has its standards, Mexico has its standards, and wherever the work is being done, the law is what applies, the national law. Now, of course, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that because Mexico had the lowest standards in terms of, what constitutes a minimum wage, what kinds of environmental regulations that a company has to adhere to. Obviously, what you would predict is exactly what happened. There was a boom in companies moving down to Mexico. And moving most of their production down to Mexico. And because the jobs that are available in Mexico are still the same low-wage jobs, we don't see any difference really in terms of immigration slowing down from Mexico back into the US. Also good to note that before NAFTA, the United States was actually exporting more to Mexico than we were taking in. And after NAFTA happens, there's a huge shift, and we suddenly have this massive trade deficit with Mexico. And I've given you a source at the bottom. It's one of the things that we were originally going to read for the class that I've cut, but all 50 states experienced job loss. Pretty hefty job loss due to NAFTA, largely in the manufacturing sector. Okay. So a couple of other broad-based impacts of NAFTA. There have been a lot of studies economists have done saying that overall, the impact of NAFTA was to increase inequality and reduce the size of the middle class. So why would a trade agreement do that? In large part, it's because if you think about all of the manufacturing jobs in the US, or a lot of the manufacturing jobs being offshore, moving into Mexico, um, people still need jobs, right? And a lot of the people who were doing those manufacturing jobs now move into service jobs. And those service jobs have a much lower rate of pay. And this point about the college degree, basically, you didn't need a college degree, right, to work in manufacturing, but you could still make a decent wage. I think I've talked about the fact that, growing up in Michigan, lots of people were in manufacturing, and they had a good standard of living, right? They were able to take vacations. They maybe even had a vacation cottage up north. Now, if you think about a plant closure happening and suddenly those manufacturing jobs aren't available, but your workforce doesn't have the qualifications to move into other kinds of work, then what's available to them are these service jobs, which pay a lower amount. And because there's so much flooding into the service sector, that labor market then has further depressed wages because it is kind of a buyer's market from the employer's perspective. You have tons of people competing for the same limited number of jobs. Um, and the third impact is a little bit more abstract, but in terms of worker power, and we've looked at this in Greenhouse, talks a little bit about this, is that now if a set of employees is trying to organize or trying to pressure the boss to provide better working conditions, maybe provide a raise or recognize a union, the employer can say, well, if you do that, we're going to move the plant to Mexico. And they actually do threaten that, but they also do move their plants to Mexico if workers unionize or demand better rates of pay or better rights. So overall, the general consensus among economists of labor has said that NAFTA has not been a great thing for the United States workers. It hasn't really been a good thing for anybody, in fact. So I wanted to take a moment to just address what happens when a plant does close down. So the picture here is of the Packard plant at the intersection of I-75 and I-94 in Detroit. And it closed down in 1953. It formerly was a manufacturer of Packards and Studebakers, and because they weren't part of and didn't get bought into the big three automakers, which is to say Chevy, Ford, and Chrysler, they went out of business. So this plant went out of commission. It had some different things happening in it, different tenants. And essentially at this point, you can see it's in ruins, but it's still standing. And it is the largest abandoned industrial site in the country. And just as a side note, it is also famous for being a place where a lot of the rave scene happened when techno was sort of becoming a big thing in Detroit. People would come in and have these like raves and just giant parties, and DJs would come. And this was all happening in the Packard plant. It's still there. Last time I was home, drove past it. Looks about the same. And on page 92 in Dana Thomas, she talks about a plant closure happening in the South and the ways in which when a company offshores, when a plant closes, it's really not just about the workers who are in this plant. So Packard employed up to 40,000 people during, the World War II and post-World War II boom era. But it really is about all of the diners, the apartment complexes and rentals, the restaurants, the grocery stores, all of the businesses around the community that sprung up around that plant. also have a ripple effect when a closure like this happens. So this is also when you talk about NAFTA and its impacts, at least on American labor, you can't leave out the fact that tons of communities were impacted in just totally devastating ways because of plant closures. And it's even more, I think, visible and even more devastating in rural communities like the one that Thomas describes in the South, because they're usually, if it's a rural community, that plant is the only game in town. So the whole community is just devastated. Okay, so if you've been watching the news, you know that we have a new NAFTA. This was part of President Trump's platform when he was running for president in 2015 and 2016. He was dead set on renegotiating NAFTA. He thought we could do a much better job. And the result of that is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, signed in February 2020. It is almost exactly the same as NAFTA. um, and after a lot of back and forth from Democrats and especially from leadership of trade unions, there are actually some small pieces in USMCA that are a slight improvement over the original NAFTA. So one of those is that if you want the tax cuts on automobiles, 75% of the parts of an automobile have to be made in one of the three countries, and so that's a slightly higher threshold than under NAFTA. 40 to 45% of those parts have to be made by workers who earn at least $16 an hour by 2023, and that comes with slightly better labor laws in Mexico, which are connected to the current president, who is more of a leftist than the previous presidents many presidents had been. And additionally, making it slightly easier for Mexican workers to unionize. We don't know yet what the impact of this will be because this is all happening in real time. And then agriculture has also been a huge issue. And in the past, there had been restrictions on dairy in particular, and some of those restrictions have been removed. So the hope is that this will be a big bump for US farmers. And I've given you a source there. Okay. So that's the bigger context of NAFTA and the USMCA. And while NAFTA is not the cause of globalization, uh, as a whole, as an umbrella, it's certainly a major driver of it. It is a law that makes it easier for that offshoring to happen. And we have seen since 1980 further and further offshoring. So a lot of our clothing now, whereas it may have been made in maquilas in Mexico, now it's exported to Central America, to Honduras, El Salvador, to parts of the Middle East, Jordan, to India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, to Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, and China. So these are all part of this kind of creeping globalization that's happened. And of course, again, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that when you offshore to countries where it's cheaper to manufacture because you can pay workers pennies instead of dollars that you would pay in the United States, and you don't have to upgrade your factories with the latest safety because there's no such thing as OSHA in other countries, or where there is an OSHA-like law, it doesn't really have any teeth. And where you don't have to upgrade your factories to worry about pollution and making sure that your emissions are clean, air quality, water quality, all of that, that something disastrous was eventually going to happen. And it did. In 2013, in April, um, in the Rana Plaza, and chapter 2 of the Dana Thomas book describes this in a lot of detail. Um, the factory, essentially, there had been a lot of structural problems with it. Um, the workers knew something was wrong. There had been a huge crack that appeared the day before, and they were told, no, you have to come to work if you would like to get paid, or face losing your job. And the entire factory, you can see in this picture, completely imploded. The largest industrial accident really in human history that we know of. 1,134 were killed and at least 2,500 more were injured. And that's basically the max capacity of that factory. So you remember when we talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in the 30s, where the doors were locked so employees couldn't leave, so that they couldn't steal during their breaks, and waste was not disposed of properly. All of these same problems were present in Rana. There had been kind of advisory reports and people trying to push for better conditions that were ignored. And once again, the doors were locked. So the full capacity of that factory, everyone in it essentially either killed or injured. So this really woke people up, at least temporarily. And for the first time in a long time, people started to talk about, people started to demand answers from fashion brands about what they were going to do about this and how complicit they were. So who were the companies who were producing in that factory? We know H&M was a major one there. How much did they know about the conditions? And this is what I said at the beginning, where you have employers who are, or companies who are saying, we didn't know. We had no idea that this was the case because we contracted to someone to provide whatever, a million shirts. They subcontracted to these 3 different places, and we don't have control over who they subcontract to. We can make suggestions, but ultimately, we don't really know. So it was actually plausible, but people for the first time in a long time started saying, well, why didn't you know? And what kind of system is this where we're essentially turning a blind eye on completely inhumane practices in the workplace, and nobody has to feel guilty about it because everybody says, I didn't know you knew. So if you can see over here, a few key features just to mention. So there's an accord that comes out called the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh. And the idea is to get brands to sign on to this. So, the consumer says, I can't do anything about it. And a lot of you had some really interesting conversations about this a couple weeks ago. The company is saying, we can't do anything about this. Everybody blames the subcontractor. The subcontractor is saying, you don't pay us enough to be able to, have a safe working environment or pay workers a living wage because you want these things for pennies on the dollar. So there was an increased pressure for companies to sign on to this accord. And what the accord says is, one, it's legally binding. So there are teeth if someone doesn't follow it. 2, it allows for independent third-party inspections and mediation processes. So rather than trusting companies to do it on their own, it brings in an outside inspector who isn't biased, doesn't have their job at stake. If they say something's wrong, they don't have to worry about being fired. This is their job to come in and do these inspections. Theoretically, at least, freedom to form unions, although that has been difficult to enforce, particularly in countries with really poor labor laws. So those are, you can see some of these features. And this is the transition accord, so this is basically just the updated version of the original accord from 2013. And there are a number of groups like United Students Against Sweatshops who are pressuring companies to sign on to this accord. However, a number of North American companies in particular chose not to sign on to the accord. And they said, we can't afford to be liable for that, and we don't have control over our supply chain. So that includes not a North American company, but IKEA, the Gap, and all of the brands under the Gap. The North Face, Walmart, Abercrombie and Fitch, and Puff Daddy's company, Sean John Apparel. So still in the North America universe, there is kind of an acceptance to say, we're going to let you get away with this. And basically, since sales aren't impacted, these companies were able to just get by without and still continue. As far as I know, this is accurate and up to date, continue to sign on without having, continue to not sign on to the accord. So there is that lack of transparency and accountability. Another piece you might see is something called the Fair Labor Association. And this is another kind of certification. It's a label that companies sign on to say that they have this, it's like saying something's certified organic. It says that you're following certain standards, that you are paying people well, that you're not using forced labor, that people have the ability to form unions, all of that kind of thing. So if you go to fairlabor.org, you can see who has signed on, and I pulled just one example of Fruit of the Loom. So Fruit of the Loom says, we signed on to this in 2002. Our parent company signed on to this. We have been accredited. We're in compliance with all of this. So that's great. That's another kind of version of one of these standards, and companies being pressured to apply for these standards in order to present itself as a responsible community partner. However, I have copied from a Solidarity article by Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. Essentially, the charge is that the Fair Labor Association label really doesn't mean that much because it doesn't require meaningful minimum wage. It still allows people to be working, up to like 100 hours and more a week. It really doesn't say much about the ability to form unions. And ultimately, the monitoring system is not outside of the companies. So where we talked about the Bangladesh Accord saying there has to be an independent third party who comes in and does this inspection, because if you have someone who's part of the company doing the inspection and they are finding a lot of problems, then that's a conflict of interest, right? They could get fired, they could be pressured into saying everything's just fine when it's not. So this Fair Labor Association label says, you only actually have to monitor 10% of your factories in any given year. You can choose the person that you want to do that. And the government and external foundations help to pay for that. And ultimately, the workers don't have a real say. There's not a lot of transparency either for the workers or the consumers. So just a kind of like things that sound really great, maybe in practice are not so great. Okay, so this is an example of what you're going to do this week, one part of your assignment on Blackboard this week, and this is the one that will feed into your assignment 3. So I have chosen a piece of clothing, and as I say, don't judge me. We're in quarantine, and it's a very comfortable shirt. So I chose this t-shirt. It is, if you look closely, it is from 2010. I am getting my money's worth out of it. It's a 5K. It's one of those shirts that when you run a race, they give you with your registration. So I registered, like 25, 35 bucks to do this 5K, and they give you a t-shirt. You can see that the back is like even sadder than the front. Yeah, it's seen some better days. Um, but trust me, it is really comfortable. So, okay, so I've chosen this t-shirt and I've shown you a picture of the tag. We can see that it's made by a company named Jerseys. Um, it is 50% cotton and 50% polyester, and it's made in El Salvador. Okay, so what we're going to do is try to dig a little bit deeper into some of the background of the company and see what we can figure out about this shirt. So what I've discovered is that Jerseys, this brand, is owned by Fruit of the Loom. Fruit of the Loom is the parent company. They own a couple of other different companies that all fall under the Fruit of the Loom label, and Jerseys is one of them. And when I look up Fruit of the Loom, I see that it is part of a much larger company called Berkshire Hathaway. Um, Berkshire Hathaway is owned by Warren Buffett. So it is worth $516.4 billion a year, or just $1 billion. That is the net worth of this empire, I'll call it. So other companies that are part of Berkshire Hathaway would be, you can see Geico is here, Pampered Chef, Duracell, Dairy Queen, Helzberg Diamonds, like everything. There's a million different pieces of this company. And they also own stocks in Coca-Cola and airlines. So there's this massive, massive portfolio. Okay. So I have that information. Now I want to look deeper into Fruit of the Loom. I'm at their website, and it says Fruit of the Loom. It's a Berkshire Hathaway company. For my purposes, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into some of Fruit of the Loom's practices because they're really the ones who have the freedom, even though they're owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway might have some requirements of the brands under its umbrella, but where I really want to focus in is on Fruit of the Loom. So I go to their website and it has all these, it's like a typical crappy WordPress site, and it's, but they probably paid someone a lot more to make it. If you go under our company and about our brands and sustainability, most brands, most major brands in particular, will have different information on their website about their policies. So on Fruit of the Loom, I found this page about their corporate social responsibility policy. This sounds great. So, they say like, they give a little history that says, here's the history of our company, and we know that a lot of this manufacturing used to be done in the United States. It was originally founded in Rhode Island, in the textile mills there, not far from where we are here. And now we know that we have these supply chains, quickly complicated supply chains, and that consumers are removed more and more from the source of where the product actually comes from. Okay, so they're acknowledging that. That seems good. Um, Going further down the page, they actually have a statement on human trafficking and modern slavery. So it turns out that the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, SB 657, right here, the CTSCA, and a similar act in the UK, require anyone who's distributing there to put out a statement about its affiliate companies, and how they respond to human trafficking and slavery in their supply chain. So this study has been done for 2018. That's the most recent one that's on their website. So they give us a definition of human trafficking, and a kind of vision statement of here's what our commitment is. Of course, we don't want to use slavery. That's wrong. Our company would never stand for that. And then we get down to the good stuff. So Fruit of the Loom has strict standards. We wouldn't allow any of these things anywhere in our supply chain. So that means contractors, subcontractors. However, sometimes something comes to our attention and we demand a remedy, or we ask that it be a plan put in place to remedy that situation. So scrolling. Then we get to, out of 382 factory assessments conducted in 2018, 10 findings in the area of forced labor were identified. So first thing, I did not actually look up how many factories total they have, but it is many more than 382. So they're not inspecting all of their factories. And there were 10 findings that have something to do with forced labor. They don't detail here for us, but they give us some examples. And some of them seem like, okay, forced labor policy and procedure not reviewed annually. Well, that's not great. That's not a best practice, but it's not like this corporation is using slavery. Okay, maybe this is okay. Lack of training for workers on forced labor policy and procedure, a little bit more problematic. Lack of or insufficient written policy to make sure that forced labor isn't used anywhere in the supply chain. That's a slightly bigger problem. Then they say we found payment of fees by foreign migrant workers for the purpose of recruitment or employment. So you asking people to pay in order to work for them. And penalizing workers for not meeting a production target, which is illegal. So instead of being paid hourly, they're saying you have to produce 1,000 pieces today, and if you don't, you're not getting paid. So they say, well, it turns out as of 2018, we had some pretty serious issues in our supply chain. And they say, we have corrective plans in place. We have not cut off our relationships with these suppliers, but there's a plan and we're happy about that. And we're going to make sure that the plan gets completed. And excuse me. Essentially, they say, we also found out in April 2018, after this report was completed, presumably, there were allegations of forced labor or slavery in Malaysia. And we commissioned an independent investigation and found out that indeed this was happening. We were using slave labor. And there's remediation efforts in place. So I find this really interesting. I would never have thought, let me look at this jankety t-shirt from 2010 that somebody bought. I looked it up. A t-shirt like this today with a 50-50 blend of cotton and polyester costs $6.68. So let's say a decade ago, it cost maybe $5 for the blank. Maybe a couple bucks for someone to print it. It is double-sided, one color printing. So if you've ever done anything like that, you know, slightly higher cost for double-sided, but it's all one color ink. Actually, it might be two colors, but it's too faded to tell. This is me during quarantine, everybody. Just kidding. This is me every day. Anyway, so I would not have thought that I could, you know, actually use the internet, go online, learn enough about the supply chain of my t-shirt to find out that it is made by a company that is pretty openly saying, yes, we have used slave labor and we have continued our relationship with this company, with this subcontractor, in spite of the fact that they're using slave labor. We've put remediation efforts in place and we don't think they're going to do it anymore, and we're going to follow up on that. But I find that pretty astounding that in 2020, like it's out there for the public. It's pretty open, and we don't really talk about it very much. So I also found a couple of sites that I recommend you look at. And one of them is called Good on You, and it looks at both environment. I haven't capped any of these. You can look at them on your own. But it rates environmental sustainability and worker treatment. The other one is a little bit older. It's called Rank a Brand, rankabrand.org. Um, and it's a little bit older. It's just been bought out by Good on You, which is kind of ironic given that we're talking about like supply chains and companies sort of buying each other out. Um, I looked up Fruit of the Loom on both of those, and the Rank of Brand, the one that's been bought out, gave it an E, like a failing grade completely, and said it has a few things that it's sort of basically everything on the website is BS. That it sort of pretends like it has decent worker policies and environmental policies, but in practice, it's very lip service, it's meaningless. And interestingly, the newer one, Good on You, gives them like 2 out of 3 for worker rights, 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5 for environmental. So it actually rates them as kind of middle of the pack. I would look at the rank a brand because at least for now, the rankings aren't too far out of date. They're going to stop updating according to their system. I think that their system is a lot better because it's a lot more transparent. When you look at how did you get this ranking, it goes through a whole system of questions about, like, is there transparency around your environmental impact? Are you using X, Y, and Z processes? And you can see the answers for each company on that, whereas Good on You is a little bit more flexible. But I think that's really interesting. So what I'd like you to do is find a red t-shirt of your own. So pick an article of clothing that you own. Look at the tag. So what's the brand? What are the materials? Where is it made? And in fact, as a side note, the Fruit of the Loom website actually lets me, it has a map that lets me zoom in on any country and look at the factories where it contracts or subcontracts to anywhere in its supply chain. So I was actually able to pull up a list of the factories that produce Fruit of the Loom in El Salvador. Now, this t-shirt is a little older, so that could have changed in the last decade. Look at how much it costs. If you're not sure, take a guess. So like I said, this shirt would have probably cost like $5, maybe 6 or 7 once you add in the printing costs. I paid for it as part of a race registration, so it was like $25 maybe in 2010. If you bought it secondhand, you can still do this, or if it was given to you as a gift. Usually, it's tacky to look up how much a gift that someone bought you costs, but try to figure it out. And if you can't find it, take a guess based on what similar things from that brand cost. If it's secondhand, you can give us both. Like I bought this, from the St. Vincent de Paul for $3, but originally it was, $50, and it's a brand that sells at Macy's or whatever it is. So give us some information. Look at who the ultimate owner is. So I traced up jerseys to Fruit of the Loom, and then Fruit of the Loom falls under this massive Warren Buffett conglomerate of Berkshire Hathaway. What other brands do they own? And on whatever level that makes the most sense for you, what statements could you find about corporate responsibility? And then for the purpose of this, I'm not asking you to do any more research than that. Just make some educated guesses about whether you think this piece of clothing has been ethically sourced. So you could think about the environmental impact. You could think about workers' conditions. You can think about whether it's fast or not. Is it affordable, which I think is part of ethically sourced? Is it reused? Is it something that you're going to have used for, a long time, or something that you will use over and over again? Or is it like, like a wedding dress. You're not going to probably wear that over and over again. No judgment. Some of us might, doing the dishes, whatever. But usually that's like a one-time, very special, but also we have a real emotional attachment to our clothing. So thinking about that as well. And so for this piece, that's it. When you look at the assignment 3 document, you'll see that basically what I'd like you to do is fact check and put some more research behind that, and then do that write up as your paper 3. And I'll give you, you'll see I have some suggestions on like search terms on websites you can go to, things like that. But for the purposes of the discussion board, just post a piece of clothing. You can include a picture if you want to. You don't have to, but just describe it for us. Tell us some of the basics about it and tell us kind of like, what's your educated guess? Do you think that this is a piece of clothing that is ethically sourced? Okay. And then the second question. So Dana Thomas spends chapters 4 and 5 talking about a lot of different companies who are doing something different. A lot of what she talks about is society of slow fashion. A lot of it is vertical integration where everything's produced in one place. And what I'd like you to do, there'll be a thread for question 2, and then there'll be different threads for like 5 of these companies. And what I'd basically like you to do is write about the pros and cons of that model. So some of them, and you can be really critical of her methodology here. I'm very critical of some of her methodology. So some of her solutions, I think in chapters 4 and 5, aren't very realistic. There's one in particular where she describes a company where the owner says, well, this is for a waitress who makes $200 in tips and then the next day spends it on a dress. I'm like, what waitress is making $200 in tips and then the next day is like, let me buy this $200 dress? It's a little out of touch, and I think a lot of what she talks about is really out of the price range of most of us. So it's great if it's ethical, but if it's completely inaccessible to the public, then that's something to really think about. So just post once in one of those threads. So you're going to have 2 posts this week, just to be clear. One about an article of clothing and 2 about one of these alternative companies. I will copy this list into the threads, and I've given you the page numbers where there's 5 or 10 page descriptions of each of these companies. Because I know that everybody's struggling right now. So if you didn't get through all of chapter 4 and 5, you can pick one and just focus on that, and just use your critical thinking skills and think through some of the pros and cons of that. For next week, you're going to finish the book, and there's it's about the same amount. I think it's like 120 pages or so. And we're going to talk more in particular about some of the environmental impacts next week. And that will lead us into our conversation about the Green New Deal and about the ways that the environmental movement and the labor movement sometimes intersect, but more often are completely separate and at odds with each other. So I hope that you have a good week. Let me know if there's anything that you need, please. And I will be on Blackboard Collaborate for the office hours. I'm thinking of all of you and hoping that you are staying healthy and safe, and that you have what you need for some more time in this crisis. Take care.